Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Academy. Now, this is fantastic, if I may say so. This is a poetry reading, as you know, and usually with poetry we think it's difficult and, foreign, strange, alien, and it's in a different language. Now, look at this. This is a fantastic turnout, I must say, and I'm very happy to say this because this is the first event in that series of Berlin Science Week events that we have. Now, strictly speaking, I don't think that this qualifies as science, but we'll see. And I know that Beth, our speaker tonight, Beth Fennelly, our poet tonight, will not only stretch the very concept of poetry, but will probably add a little bit of science to it, so that in the end we do merit this wonderful cube, which we're supposed to give back tomorrow. It arrived this morning, I hear, and this is fantastic. And if you look closely, you will see that this is the title of your talk. This is fantastic. I just love it. This is wonderful. So I'm so pleased that you're here. I know that few people know that when you packed your suitcase back home in the States to come to Berlin, you learned in August of this year that you'd be the Poet Laureate of Mississippi. And that is quite something. So we are so fortunate and we are so lucky to have you here, our very own Poet Laureate at the American Academy during Science Week. This is something that's really special. Now, I promise, first of all, to be brief and short and snappy, not to overdo it, so I will stop here. I did promise not to, go over your biography, when and where you were born, those kinds of things, and the books that you've published. Let me just say that when you look up your name on the internet, and especially when you talk to your spies that you have in Heidelberg and other places where you've been before you actually read here, I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that Beth Ann is a gifted speaker. She's not only an excellent poet, but really the audience loves her. And this is what we're going to do tonight. Before you start, let me very briefly say that the one thing I wanted to clarify at this point is, does everybody know what a poet laureate is? I'm saying this, it's a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer it in a minute, because not everybody has a background in literature. Not everybody knows that since antiquity, poetry has been cherished and appreciated to such a degree that very special people were given, if you like, an award, the laurel. And the poet laureate has always been, since the dawn of mankind, a very special person to use language to a certain effect. Language not just as a mere means of communication, but something that goes beyond it. And I think the very concept of having a poet laureate shows a degree of appreciation for not only public speaking, but for the way that poets use language, that very nicely, that you to a certain degree epitomize and reflect and show and demonstrate and will demonstrate to us this evening. So I'm very happy that you're here, Beth Fennelly, our very own poet, our very own poet laureate in the tradition of Petrarch and all the big names. And we will see what it means to compose micro texts. I will not go into this. We're very much looking forward to your presentation tonight, and I'm very happy to say that you agreed to answer a couple of questions afterwards, or comments, maybe. We'll see where this takes us, but rest assured we will have a presentation, a reception, not a presentation as now, a reception after your talk, and we can then probably extend that conversation. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation tonight. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you very much, Beth Fennelly, for being our speaker tonight.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for being here, coming out. And Thomas Rommel, thank you for inviting me to speak for Science Week, for which I am spectacularly unqualified. And it's just a good chance to thank the fine folk at the Academy. We are so grateful for the hospitality team, especially Thomas Heller and Renee Alborn, and we adore the kitchen staff. And every time I think about Stefan stuffing a trick-or-treat bag for my kids, I get a little melty inside, and especially the program staff. So every time I have existential angst, I go down to the room where I can find Tina and Joanna and John and Carol, and they've been so kind to me. John especially has helped with travel and computers, and he knows all the good bars. And Carol has been kind to me even before we arrived. She started giving me tips and advice, and you are so easy being kind. It's really lovely, and you've made our time here better. So thank you. And then, thank you to the fellows and the spouses. It could be in the 20-year history of the Academy, there has been a class more collegial, better at Pilates, but I don't think so. So, I'm very happy to be here and be part of y'all. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a book I have coming out in a year, and in a way, it's a follow-up to the last book called A Tilted World that I wrote with my charming husband, Tom Franklin. So we wrote this book together. It's a co-authored novel. It was set in the flood of the Mississippi River in 1927. And it took the two of us 4 years to write it. There was a ton of research into this historical time period, and we had to learn how to write together, and we had to get everything right, and it was a big book. There were high stakes. I mean, that would not have been great for our marriage if, the novel was a dismal failure. Oh my God, 4 years, two of us. But, we did publish a novel. It was fine. It was great. And then came this period after the novel in which I kept saying, I'm not writing. I kept thinking, I'm not writing, because I was just putting these crazy little things in my notebook, just weird little ideas I was having, or thoughts, or quick little memories. And I kept saying to Tommy, I'm not writing right now. I'm in a period where I'm not writing, but I was having so much fun, and these strange little things were zipping through my head long after I'd left my desk. And then it occurred to me, what if this is a type of writing that I don't recognize as writing? It's not looking like a poem or a long essay or a chapter in a novel. But what if these little tiny things are what I need to be doing? And the metaphor that I thought of that helped me end up writing the book was the idea of a hummingbird. Hummingbirds come through Mississippi, where we live, in the fall. They funnel down from Canada and North America. They double their weight to 2 pennies worth. They lift off from Mississippi and the areas around the Gulf, and they fly 500 miles without stopping to winter in Yucatan and Mexico and Belize, Central America. And there are some things the hummingbird can only do because it's small. For example, it's the only bird that can fly forward, backward, up, down, sideways, hover, or for brief periods of time, fly upside down, which is why it's the symbol for the American Helicopter Society. The hummingbird has the fastest wingspan of any bird. It has the greatest brain to body ratio of any bird. And a lot of the things it can do, it can only do because it's so ridiculously small. And I thought, I want to write hummingbirds of words. What would it be like to look at these crazy small things I'm doing and see what can you only do if you do it in a small amount of space as possible? So I decided I would take these and I'd finish and I'd write a book. And that book is now coming out a year from now. It's called Heating and Cooling, 52 Micro-Memoirs. So I thought, okay, 4 rules for myself. Get in and out as fast as possible, like a hummingbird. 2, I'm not interested in the fragment. A lot of people are interested in the fragment. The fragment's fascinating and people do it really well. But I want the whole thing. I want everything to stand by itself and be cool just for a minute by itself. Because you don't look at a hummingbird and think, gosh, if only I had 20 of them, it'd be like a small sparrow. You just appreciate it for that very little thing it is. I wanted the book to have a lot of physical variation, to vary in size, and I'm committed to the sentence. I'm in love with the sentence right now, but I wanted all the pieces to look different. And lastly, I wanted the book to be diverse in tone. So maybe some of them would be funny, or some would be sad, or some would be wry, but overall, reading the book, you'd have the experience of the fullness of the human experience I guess maybe that sounds highfalutin, but I just mean I wanted to put as much me into the book as I could. I wanted all the meanness there, even the bad parts. So instead of talking more about it, I'll give you an example, and this is the first one in the book, and it's called Married Love. In every book my husband's written, a character named Colin suffers a horrible death. This is because my boyfriend, before I met my husband, was named Colin. In addition to being named Colin, he was Scottish and an architect. So you understand my husband's feelings of inadequacy. My husband cannot build a tall building of many stories. He can only build a story and then push Colin out of it. One thing I'm really attracted to with this super short form is that the form seems kind of modest to me, almost a response to this great man kind of literature that we have in America that equates ambition with size. This kind of trajectory where, you have Hemingway, Mailer, Roth, DeLillo, Franzen, doing this short thing as another kind of alternative, which is a way of saying a hummingbird is not a failed eagle. Some of the moments I found were just strange little moments that I remembered that I always have thought about in the years and not really understood why they were important to me, that I've gone back and kind of rescued. Here's one. One does not always wish to converse on airplanes. But this tanned, fit couple, white sweatered, like tennis pros, seemed to want to talk. So we talked. No, their final destination wasn't Denver. They'd continue to Hawaii after the layover. How awesome, I said. Hawaii, is it a special occasion, an anniversary? They grinned at each other like, you tell her, no, you. Their thing, it turned out, was scuba diving with metal detectors. They dove at popular honeymoon sites on Oahu because, they said, the first time those rich Japanese brides hit the water, their new diamonds slid right off. The couple said they didn't always find a ring, but overall they'd found enough to fund their vacations. That's wow, I said. They grinned at each other again, and she gave his biceps a squeeze. As they reached for their Bloody Marys, I envisioned how, after netting a big rock, they'd perform exceedingly athletic hotel sex. Their avarice was so unabashed that it was difficult to keep despising them. But I, small of diamond and large of righteousness, persevered all the way to Denver. So I told you I wanted a lot of range in the book, and that's kind of an example of a chattier one. Some of them are more poetic or metaphorical, and in fact could almost be called, prose poems, which I've written before, with the exception that it's very important to me to hew to the restriction of truth that you find in memoir. I would not cheat on the truth the way I would not cheat on the, say if you're a poet and you're writing a sonnet, you have the restriction of the sonnet. There'd not be pleasure in cheating on that sonnet form. In the way for me, there wouldn't be pleasure in fictionalizing So I wanted to work in the realm of lived truth in this book. Yet this is in the spectrum of ones that would be closer to poetry than sheer prose. I wrote this one because I was at an event and there was a gentleman and he was introducing his mentor. And he was introducing his mentor and talking about how much this man had meant to him, and he started to cry. And I actually found it really adorable, but he was embarrassed. He said, "I can't believe it, I'm up here, I'm acting like such a pussy." So a couple of days went by and I was still thinking of this moment when he had chosen to use that word. And I was thinking, why is that so hard for me? And I thought, it's not just that it's vulgar, because I can be vulgar. It's that it's a bad metaphor. So I wrote this. What I think about when someone uses pussy as a synonym for weak. At the deepest part of the deepest part, I rocked shut like a stone. I'd climbed as far inside me as I could. Everything else had fallen away. Husband, midwife, bedroom, world, quaint concepts. My eyes were clamshells. My ears were clapped shut by the palms of the dead. My throat was stoppered with bees. I was the fox caught in the trap, and I was the trap. Chewing a leg off would have been easier than what I now required of myself. I understood I was alone in it. I understood I would come back from there with the baby, or I wouldn't come back at all. I was beyond the ministrations of loved ones. I was beyond the grasp of men. Even their prayers couldn't penetrate me. The pain was such that I made peace with that. I did not fear death. Fear was an emotion, and pain had scalded away all emotion. I chose. In order to come back from there with the baby, I had to tear it out at the root. Understand, I did this without the aid of my hands. So I thought I'd read you a couple itty-bitty ones. I have a whole bunch in the book that are 1 or 2 sentences. Why I'm switching salons. We can put on a top coat with glitter, said the manicurist. We all know how you feel about glitter. I come from a long line of modest achievers. I'm fond of recalling how my mother is fond of recalling how my great-grandfather was the first person to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge on the second day. Another reason I love my mother. At the baby shower, she rejects the pink M&Ms because pink M&Ms are unnatural. I thought I would share with you just one longer one. There are a couple that are 2 or 3 pages in the book. Later, it seemed to me when I looked back, those were ones when I had reached back into my childhood or adolescence and plucked up a moment that I wanted to revisit. And I think it's because in order to do that, you end up having to create 2 narrators. There's the narrator, the I of the then, and the I of the now. And the I of the now is looking back at that moment, but you have to clarify the space and time, and it's almost really like creating a first-person narrator in a novel twice, so it takes more space. This is the one I've chosen to share with you. It's called Goner. That morning, after Mass, the priest visited our 3rd grade to announce a meeting for prospective altar boys. I went. Me, Beth Ann. Why did I go? First, I was attracted to the pageantry, the costuming with the alb and cincture, the procession with the cross, and the thurible filled with incense. I wanted to arrange the credence table, the corporal, the cruet, and the ciborium. I wanted to lift the aspersorium of holy water into which the priest dipped the aspergillum before raining blessings on penitent heads. When he lifted the Eucharist, I wanted to twist the cluster of brass sanctus bells, alerting our souls to transubstantiation, bread and wine miracled into body and blood. And clearly, I wanted to fill the chalice of my mouth with the wine of those words. Also, I went to prove a point, but I never got the chance. Before the meeting began, Father Mayer evicted me from the front pew. "I'll be right back," he told my classmates, then steered me by my shoulder to the sacristy where, behind a heavy door, a few old ladies bent over ironing boards. "The Altar Society," he informed me, "cares for the priestly vestments. This is where you're called to serve." He fled, and I fled, and that evening I wrote in my best penmanship, tattling on him, to Cardinal Joseph Bernardine. My letter ended, "P.S. and women should be priests." My mom loved the letter. How cute, our little women's liber. Now, a grown woman with children of my own, back in Illinois at my mother's table, I read in the Trib of church files that document Father Mayer sexually molested altar boys for decades. He'd been removed from St. Mary's and sent to St. Edna's, removed from St. Edna's and sent to St. Stephen's, removed from St. Stephen's and sent to St. Dionysius, removed from St. Dionysius and to St. Odillos. All those altered boys. Did the archdiocese, the cardinal, know? Please. In the files, there's a contract Father Mayer had to sign, promising that at St. Odillos he wouldn't be with boys younger than 21. Because by then, 2 of his altar boys had committed suicide. After St. Odillos, he was sent to jail. You can look all of this up if you care to. Father Robert E. Mayer, pastor of St. Mary's, Lake Forest, Illinois, 1975 to 1981. Call this fiction, I dare you. I lay the newspaper down in a light that is no longer the light of my mother's kitchen, but is the stained light of St. Mary's, where solid pillars of dust propped up the clerestory windows. And in this light, I see it all anew. I see it all anew, and I see it clear as a bell, as we say, as if cued by altar boys twisting the sanctus bells, announcing that something has been transubstantiated into something else forever. The ironing women who lifted the blank communion wafers of their faces. The click of dress shoes as father rushed back to the meeting, his robes streaming behind him like wings. A few years later, his sudden sabbatical, his goodbye potluck. My outrage at not being chosen, my bad luck at being born a girl. My classmate, Donnie Odell, who was chosen. During Mass that unseasonably warm Easter, he was holding high the Bible, rigid and dutiful, when suddenly he toppled backward. The whole congregation heard the sickening thwack of skull on marble. And as one, we uttered the same surprised "oh," as if it were part of Mass, as if a response had been inserted before the Agnus Dei. "Oh," we cried in a single voice, and how quickly Father was at his side, bending, lifting in his arms the small boy, Donnie Odell, a boy even smaller than I was. Donnie in his arms like Jesus removed from the cross, or with his white alb flowing toward the floor like a bride. And how Donnie raised a hand and opened his eyes and realized that he'd fainted and smiled sheepishly. How the parishioners laughed, a relieved laugh, to see he was okay. How the ushers led Donnie outside into the fresh air. How later, filing into the narthex, everyone laughed again with Mrs. Odell. "Your son gave us quite a scare, Nance. For a moment, we thought he was a goner." Wow, I haven't read that one before aloud, and I got so hot up here. I guess I felt angry all over again. Or I just entered into menopause right here in front of you or something, but I'm sweating now. I'm sweating from that. So this is also where I guess I confess I haven't read a lot of these before. The book comes out in a year. I've read dribbles and drops of them here and there, but I haven't read from the book entirely. But I knew that there'd be so many friends here tonight. I felt like it was a safe environment. So I'll read one that's a little over a page. And my book is dedicated to Tommy's father, who passed away in February, and this one is for him. Salvage. Tommy's parents wave from the porch as our minivan pulls up. His dad smiles, and that's when I see he's missing about half of his teeth. Before retiring a few years back, Gerald had been a mechanic. During high school, he'd apprenticed at his uncle's garage, then serviced Army vehicles while stationed in Germany, then returned home and kept fixing cars. Worked from can to can't. Worked Saturdays, feeding himself into the maw of trucks in un-air-conditioned Alabama, feeding a wife and 3 kids. Eventually, he'd own his own shop, Franklin Automotive. In addition to repairs, he had a line on totals, wrecks the insurance company didn't consider worth fixing. Gerald considered otherwise. He'd buy 2 or 3 of the same model at salvage auction and Frankenstein them together. Technically, he wasn't allowed to sell them, branded title and all that, but he figured there was no harm in it as long as the customer knew. He loved to negotiate, and that man could sell an icebox to an Eskimo. 20 years before, I'd bought my first car from him after Tommy and I were engaged. I drove it, a black Cherokee, for 4 years, but it was haunted. Before he'd cobbled it together, I'd made the mistake of wandering his scrapyard and discovered the salvaged Jeeps. I stepped over the witch grass and peered into the badly front-ended wreck. Dangling from the spider-webbed windshield, a long blonde hair. Gerald's body, 82, is the one chassis he can't repair. Shingles, macular degeneration, hypertension, a spot on his kidney that needs watching, pneumonia, asthma, steroids for the asthma. So many small parts failures. And now, the teeth. He stopped going to the dentist years ago. Finally gotten his rotten ones pulled. Gerald sighs as we lower ourselves into the living room's recliners. New teeth, he's been told, will cost him a pretty penny. How much, we ask? 16,000. He pauses. Wish I knew how much use I'd get out of them. He fiddles with his inhaler. How much longer I'll be here below? How many meals I got left, you reckon? Tommy, Tommy's mom, and me? What can we do but shrug? Don't need a full set, he says, addressing the ceiling as if bargaining, as if God's scrapyard is lousy with spare teeth, all reasonable offers considered. This, coming from a man who worked 6 days a week for over 60 years. All's I need's enough to chew a steak. So when I was younger, I wished I were a political writer because I'd feel things so strongly. But the things I felt didn't come out well as opinions. They came out as narrative or metaphor. And all these years later, I realized that the strong feelings are still there, just in a different form, because really what that piece is about for me is my rage at American healthcare system that leaves people abandoned when they're their most vulnerable. And this is just a 1-line or 2-line, actually follow-up to that. Addendum to salvage. I won $1,000 in a literary contest for one of these essays. Bought my father-in-law a tooth. This is the last one I'll read, and then I'll just say, thank you. And if you have questions, I'm happy to take them, but I'll finish with this. A few weeks ago, our colleague, Daniel Joseph Martinez, gave a great talk, and he said he was beginning and ending his talk with love. And that resonated with me because love is the theme in my book. It's actually the beginning and ending. Married love is I have 7 different pieces called Married Love in the book. And the reason why I was interested in the idea of married love is because when I met Tommy, first day of graduate school, all those years ago, I was writing him love poems, and he was this singular obsessive focus, and they were so romantic, and all these years later, I'm still writing about him, but the love has changed, and it's ripened, and it has room now for other things like a wryness or a humor that you wouldn't find in that kind of early idealism, and it's actually more interesting to me. So this is an example of that. Married love. I took a spectacular fall during a run, a real airborne wipeout that ended with a hard bounce and a gravel spraying skid. I was pretty banged up, especially my left palm and my knees, which were rivering blood down my shins. But nothing seemed broken. I limped home, grateful to find my husband. He makes me braver. It's nothing, I countered, as he cooed and washed my wounds and dressed them in monster bandages. My knees scabbed quickly, but I couldn't get the palm to heal because I assumed I couldn't keep it rested and dry, what with 3 small children in my dominion. Finally, it scabbed over in a thick, puckered star. It had a black lump, and it itched. Gradually, the star shrunk until finally all that was left was a weird white blister, still black at the tip. I waited for the blister to shrink, but it didn't. I waited for the black tip to fade, but it didn't. Although my palm didn't hurt, as long as I didn't applaud or do push-ups, it looked ugly. My youngest wouldn't hold my bad hand when we walked to pre-K. And after a while, I began to have the discomforting feeling that the black thing was a foreign object inside my hand. That my hand grew the white pillow to push away the black thing. When I called faculty health and the nurse asked the reason for my appointment, I described my blister. She paused, then said, "Can you come in right away?" I did, but the examining GP shook her head and said I'd have to see a hand surgeon in Jackson. A hand surgeon? Really? In Jackson? Really? She asked, "What days are you free this week?" Now it was my turn to shake my head. Couldn't we just, she said. "Let me see if Dr. Yates is in the building." "Shoot," Dr. Yates drawled a few minutes later, palpating his fleshy thumbs around my palm. "We got this." He had me lie back and gave my hand a shot and then called loudly for his nurse to bring him his scalpel with the claws. Thus began the play-by-play that included "almost got it" and "whoopsie" and "slippery little devil" and, I started out as an English major. I could take the pain, but not the narration. I began to think I might pass out. Finally, after he said, "I'm just going to rummage around here until I nab it," I told him I was glad he was taking care of me, but hoped he could continue silently. He didn't speak again until he said, "Looky here." When I opened my eyes, he pointed to a surprisingly neat incision in my palm, like a slit for a dime. Proudly, he bandaged me, then handed me a plastic syringe. Inside its calibrated tube, a jagged piece of gravel. I was glad my husband was home because I couldn't wait to show him. I held the syringe before his eyes, flicked it to make it rattle, and we both laughed a little. My husband said, "What are you going to do with it?" "Do with it? I'm going to pitch it." "I want it." "You want it?" "Yeah, I want it. I want to keep it. I'll put it in my office. It was in your hand for a month. It was a part of you." I want to marry this man, I thought. I want to marry him right now. But of course, I already had about 19 years before. So, thank you. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Thank you. So I'm happy to take a question if anyone has one, but sometimes it's awkward to ask questions. So if you don't have one, we can just go drink. No one's going to ask a question. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more. Ooh.
You don't have to do that. I mean, I can probably repeat the question if you want. Is that easier? Yeah.
Wow, okay. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you consider to be your obligation to the truth, because I know, especially, you're considering language as a kind of right, it has its own internal music, and
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean you have to lie, but obviously you're forced to
Yeah, so the question here is about obligation to the truth, and I have to say, I have a very hard line about the truth. I believe in the truth. And the reason is because I have done all these fictional forms in which I was free to make stuff up, to use the truth if I wanted to use the truth and not use it. But when I'm saying something is essay or it's memoir, I believe that it must hew to the truth, because if you abandon the truth, you leave it morally void. And I remember a great writer, Nick Flynn, he's a poet and memoirist, and he was talking about the writer's obligation to the truth. And he said, it's, we look back on events and we have to gather the stepping stones to get us where we are now. And isn't that our job as writers? The job of the writer is to say, this is who I am and how did I get here? And these are the most important ways that I got here. And if you start making that stuff up, it voids who you are now. And he gave the example of his father going to jail. And if the events that led him going to jail have a path, a trajectory. And if you make something up 6 months ago that didn't happen, it invalidates the path. So I do think that one must work with the truth, but I believe, like I was saying, it's a restriction like any other art form, like a sonnet with a rhyme scheme. You just have to figure out the way to let the truth work for you. I would say sometimes it even has to do with reordering the time periods, like the structure of an essay or a memoir, but keeping when things happen as they really happened. It's always tricky, though, and I feel like this answer was a little abstract. It'd be easier if we had something to look at,
Can we look at the dialogue in the story about Tommy's father, maybe?
Yeah. So in that situation, so here's a good example of what is even the truth, because there were probably, we probably sat in those recliners for about 2 hours and came to his teeth and then circled away from it and came back to the teeth. And I felt free to edit out all the stuff that was stupid and just to keep the important stuff that mattered to the story. But I wouldn't consider that telling a lie. I consider that using a writer's tools, But I also wouldn't put into his mouth something that he didn't say. And plus, I couldn't even come up with "All I need's enough to chew a steak." Do you know what I mean? Like, that is poetry, and that's the poetry of a man who's worked with his hands all those years, and has that kind of resigned attitude about not having teeth, So I wouldn't, would I add something into the poem, like some illness that he had, or would I change who was in the room? I just wouldn't do it. I do know writers, good writers, friends of mine, who feel easier. They don't have the same anxiety about messing with the truth. And I'm not necessarily even criticizing them. I'm just saying, what does this art form do to me? If I like to practice, I'm really greedy. So if I'm trying to do all these different genres, what does memoir have to offer me? It's a way to figure out the truth. Anybody else? Go ahead, Paul.
What's it like being Paul Laureate of Mississippi?
Well, I wouldn't know, because as soon as I was announced, I came to Berlin. Isn't that terrible? Really, truly, that's what happened.
Do you feel like you have to be some kind of a voice of Mississippi, or represent it, or write a poem or a story for it?
No. Short answer, no, which is to say, we have a terrible governor. And if I felt like that my position was supporting him in any way, I would have had to, turn it down. But really, a lot of the stuff I already feel passionately about is just something now I'm expected to do. For example, I really believe in the importance of getting poetry into kids' ears, because I think children naturally love language and, the way they clap and the way they jump rope and the music and the hedonism, the pleasure of noise and nonsense. And then they go to school and what's poetry? Well, it's haiku. You have to count out the syllables. And, this terrible thing happens where education, leaches the joy out of literature. And then, so I just want them to have the experience, for example, of memorizing poetry is something I'm involved in. I'm involved in a program that's actually sponsored by the U.S. government called Poetry Out Loud, where they have recitation contests. So that's something I've been involved in all along, and now that's one of my duties. So I don't actually imagine that much will change, because I've already, volunteer work is really an important part of what I think it means to be a human on Earth, So That's already happening. Will I have to write state poems? God, no. They would be awful, you know? Really bad. But I do love the state of Mississippi. It's so troubled, but it's a beautiful place. Y'all should come. Road trip. Yeah. Go ahead, Carol. Oh, you'll come? You'll come on a road trip?
I would love to road trip. I'm from Michigan, so I...
Yeah, that's a ways. Yeah.
Since you're talking about reciting poems, would you recite as one of your favorites?
I could, but I'll tell you this. 2 weeks from tonight, my charming husband is doing his fellows presentation here. And in lieu of introduction, he's asked me to read a love poem that I wrote about him a long time ago. So maybe I'll leave that out as a teaser, because I feel like, you might be like, enough's enough, shut up there. So come 2 weeks from now. Oh, and I should tell you, a week from tonight, Thursday, I'm reading at Fry University. So if you have any friends who want to go to a reading, tell them to come. It's at 6:15, which is an odd time, but at that Kennedy Institute of Fry University, because every single person I know in Berlin, I made come here tonight. So who's going to come to that one? I don't know. So anyway, come to that, and then come 2 weeks from tonight to hear Tommy, and you will get a poem. Yes, ma'am.
The American South is noted as having produced probably the most fertile soil for American literature and poetry in the country. And if I understand correctly, you come from Illinois and somehow ended up experiencing your vocation in Mississippi.
That's right.
Have you experienced any of that distinctive soil?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have to say, I'm interested in the concept of home and why a place feels like home, and how sometimes even the place where you grew up doesn't feel like home, and then you move to a new place and it feels like home. And I'm sure there's some expats in the audience who kind of know what I'm talking about. And for me, that happened, moving to the South. And I understand home is a psychological state, but I thought, why am I feeling like I fit in here? Or not even fit in terms of blend in, but why does this feel like, the native soil for me? And later I ended up thinking maybe it even has partially to do with how many Scotch-Irish settled the South, and my family is Irish Catholic, and the things I love about being Irish, like storytelling and family, and the importance of community, all are very strongly in Mississippi. And there's even a parallel for me, like someone said to Faulkner, why are there so many good writers in the South? And he talked about the human heart in conflict with itself, and that these places where there have been tremendous conflict have also been places that have produced tremendous writers. And I think about Ireland and Mississippi as, so Mississippi, my beloved adopted home state, highest teenage pregnancy rate in the nation, fattest state in the nation. I mean, I could go on and on, everything appalling, but like most Pulitzer Prize winning writers, it just doesn't make sense, But it still is a culture where oral culture is very important, storytelling and reading. I hardly understand it, but I do count myself lucky to be living there. More PR for the road trip, right? Yeah, come on. Though I also love Berlin. Hello.
Yeah, I was curious also in terms of Mississippi. I told you I traveled there once, and the culture that I found so fascinating is the blues culture.
Yeah.
Do you see some of your work, or also your notion of truth related to blues in one way or the other?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that so much of the power of blues music comes from truth-telling and telling the difficult truths, And so this is Beth, who is at the American Center at University of Göttingen, just so everyone knows we have this wonderful scholar in our midst. But yes, I do very much feel the blues tradition there. I would say one of the difficult things about Mississippi is young African-American people right now aren't listening to the blues. They're listening to hip-hop. And so you do have a strange situation where a lot of the really great blues musicians in Mississippi are elderly, and sort of dying off. I am a little concerned about that, but there have been tremendous efforts in oral research and archives that are kind of collecting that stuff, but how long does it live if it's not being embraced, I am a little worried about that.
Does it live forth in Chicago?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's that huge pipeline from Mississippi to Chicago that is still there, right under the surface. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? Should we get a wine? Jennifer's got the last question, then we're going to drink wine.
I was struck when you were talking about having each of the micro-memoirs have a structure in itself to be complete, to be whole.
Yeah.
But I wondered then how you sort of put them together into a book that is itself a whole, and if you could talk a little bit about that conception of getting the pieces to work.
Yeah, that makes it a lot harder because the book's not chronological and they're not like fragments that like coalesce into a whole, like every part, so you could technically read the book in any order, It's more like structuring a collection of poems, which is really, really difficult. But what I was thinking about is, and so, I have ones from my childhood, adolescence, adulthood. I have ones that are all these different tones. How are they going to fit into one book? And what I end up thinking about is they're all moderated through this single unifying presence of coming out of my brain, an aspect of my voice. But even then, I had to cut out a lot. So I'll confess, my original plan for the book was 100. And I ended up cutting ones out, not because they sucked necessarily, but because they seemed like outliers. Sometimes that was interesting, but I felt ultimately like I needed to give like a more coalesced feeling. And really, I ended up kind of thinking about structuring the book around love in various aspects. But I don't necessarily know if that would be so apparent to everybody, but that's one way I chose what to include and what to exclude. But I'm actually still making changes on the little guys. So maybe stuff you'll hear now is going to be changed by the time it's published. Go ahead, Rebecca.
It just follows up on that, the sequence. How did you decide on the sequence?
Yeah, so I just spread them out on the floor and walked around for a long time. Is that like the least scientific Science Week explanation you've ever heard in your life? Yeah, and then I just thought about, short ones mashed up with long ones. And then, I was interested in exploring ugly parts of my personality, and I hope that's okay to say, but I think like jealousy is a really interesting emotion. And motherhood is one of my big topics. I'm really fascinated with motherhood because I think it's represented poorly. I think it's sentimentalized and cheapened, and I'm interested in real motherhood. So some of the ones I ended up writing about motherhood aren't pretty. They're kind of shocking. And so I would have to take one like that and place it next to one where I was a nice person. So you end up thinking of all these crazy things. But there, I had to, I couldn't open with a couple that, would have been off-putting, even though I wanted to, I don't know. Okay, friends, I've loved tonight. I'm so happy you all came to visit. Let's visit with a glass of wine and talk some more. Thank you.